This week on Dialogue, the quarterly report, Lessons of the Great Depression. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. And once each quarter, we take a look at the latest issue of the Wilson Center's flagship publication, the Wilson Quarterly, with the help of its editor, Steve Lagerfeld. And Steve, nice to welcome you back to the program.
It's good to be back, John. Thanks.
We're also joined today by Robert Aliber, a contributor to the current issue and a former Wilson Center Fellow. Mr. Aliber is a professor emeritus of international economics and finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Also joining us, David Wessel. David is a current public policy scholar at the center. When he's not here, he serves as economics editor for the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, welcome again, and I'll show our viewers the current cover. And for those joining us via radio, we should tell them it's an iconic image from the Great Depression, Lessons of the Great Depression.
That's right. And the picture shows a man in front of the Capitol selling apples to a congressman. And we thought that really captured some of the sense of foreboding that was in the air, especially when we commissioned this.
ALAR-free apples when in Congress, right?
Right.
Now you've revisited the economy again. Is this the story of our times? It's unavoidable. You're going to be revisiting again after this issue as well?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I said to one contributor at one point, John, I said, my readers don't really come to us for economics. I don't think it's really what they mainly want from us. And he said, well, they better get used to it, because I do think that's right. It's not only the present, economic problems that we're having, but, in the future, with global competition, it's going to be something we're going to be thinking about in many different ways.
One of your contributors, Bob Aliber, is with us. If you could tee up the cover cluster, tell us about the stories that appear and the angles that you've covered the subject matter from.
We have three pieces in there. Bear in mind this was commissioned back in probably September when the mood was dark. There was a lot of talk about the Great Depression, echoes of the Great Depression, and what we wanted to do was to look and see if there was more than talk behind that. Mm-hmm. So we have Robert Samuelson, the Washington Post columnist and a longtime economic observer, on his view of the lessons of the Great Depression and sort of trying to suss out, not only looking at statistics, but looking at underlying causes and so on. And along with that, a young scholar from Cornell, Louis Hyman, who's written a couple of really good books on debt, on credit, and underlining the sort of importance of that in our economy, something that I think most of us don't understand, number one. Number two, Louis gave us a really good, fascinating account of sort of the evolution of mortgage-backed securities, collateralized mortgage obligations, and it's a long and interesting story, but how we got from the 1920s when we had a almost similar kind of setup as we've had in the last couple of decades. We had the collapse of the Depression and the rebuilding of kind of credit structure that had again collapsed. It's a really, I think, significant story and an important thing for people to understand. And then, of course, my good friend and the distinguished economist Robert Aliber, with his piece thinking about whether this is a recession or a depression or what, and he has his own answer. I won't let the cat out of the bag.
And we want, before, and when you start using all the economics terms, I'm sure that I feel like a math test coming on and I'm freezing up. That's why I'm glad we have Bob Aliber and Dave Wessel with us to sort through it. And gentlemen, if we could begin with a definition. I know these aren't 100% precise scientific terms, but generally speaking, what are we talking about when we use the term recession versus the term depression? And we'll have both of you help us construct a definition together.
When we use the term recession, we think of a decline in economic activity from peak to trough that might be 1% to 2% of GDP, and an increase in the unemployment rate based on the experience of the last 50 years, of 2 to 3 percentage points. When we think about a depression, we're thinking about a much sharper decline in the level of economic activity from peak to trough, 10, 15, 20%, and a surge in the unemployment rate, perhaps to 20%. The base unemployment rate is always sort of 5%. That's full employment. So in a recession, we might go from, let's say, 5% to 8% or 9%, an increase of 4 percentage points. In a depression, we go from, let's say, full employment of 5% to 20%. That's an increase by a factor of 3. Very significant difference in terms of what happens to GDP and what happens to unemployment.
I think Bob captures it well. I think the thing that's interesting is that we were used to, after World War II, recessions. And they were relatively short, and things came back relatively quickly. And as Bob points out in his piece, what we've just been through is, it's not like the Great Depression. You call it a mini depression, right? But it does have this rather disturbing and painful attribute that the recovery has been very slow. It may be getting a little quicker now, but we still have well over 8% of the people out of work officially, and many more who've given up working. That's just something that we haven't gone through in this country in my lifetime.
So is the notion of a depression or a mini depression more than hyperbole? Is this measurably worse than the previous, and what was it, 10 recessions since World War II prior to this one?
Yes, it's measurably worse. And as Bob points out in his piece, what's so interesting is that some of the things that preceded the Great Depression preceded this painful episode, the run-up in house prices, for instance. And we've also, and I think it comes out in the piece, had a very different response. So the reason we don't have 25% unemployment today is not nature, it's acts of man, acts of policymakers who jumped in, and in my view, get too little credit for jumping in.
Along those lines, since you bring it up now, I wanted at some point to see if we could settle something here, at least from the perspective of our expert guests. Is politically, the so-called bailout and the various activities of the government, starting with TARP, have been characterized when in a political debate as ineffective, didn't do anything, a waste of taxpayer money, or as doing what David just described, stopping us from going over the cliff into a full depression. I'd ask both of you to provide your analysis. Which is right? Beyond the politics, technically speaking, which is correct?
The bailout measures were remarkably successful and also profitable. So the government has made a profit on TARP. The government almost certainly will make a profit on the bailout of AIG, the large insurance company. If the government had not changed its policy toward rescuing financial institutions that were more or less under siege, if it had not changed its policy on the day after the Lehman collapse, we would have had another Great Depression. So it was the decisions on the Monday and the Tuesday in mid-September 2008 that may have made this great difference. But the big difference between the recessions that we've had in the post-war period and the events in 2008 is that this is the only recession that has been associated with a major collapse of leading financial institutions, of Countrywide Financial and Washington Mutual, the pressures on Bank of America and Citibank, Wachovia, the collapse of Merrill Lynch. The leading financial firms, a high percentage of the leading financial firms either failed or would have failed if the government had not come in to provide funds.
It's a lot of companies with a lot of Wall Street Journal subscriptions, I'm guessing, on that list. Well, how do you view this notion of, and you know, one thing I'm wondering, David, as a working journalist who's writing about this stuff all the time, how do you cut through the politics to get to some fundamental truths about this? Because, you know, politicians will always spin it in their favor, not give enough credit when it's the other side, take too much credit when it's their side. How do you sort through this rubble?
Well, I read Bob Aliber and help me get it as a guide. Look, the average politician's public explanation of what's going on in the economy is really often not worth listening to.
Useless.
I think that but it's difficult. So what's required is to say to people, look, we have a lousy economy, but it would have been worse had we not done this. And that's a concept that economists are very comfortable with. What would have happened had we not done this? But the public isn't. People don't understand how could this have been different. Secondly, there was a lot of unfairness in this thing. When you bail out the banks, the people who are lending money to the banks get bailed out. And it's very hard for people to accept that some people made money on this and some people lost their jobs. And that unfairness may have prevented something worse, but it doesn't make it any more palatable. And the third thing is that it's not like, and I'm sure Bob would agree, it's not like this was perfect. As he points out in the piece, if they had moved before Lehman Brothers, maybe we would have spared ourselves some pain. And there are plenty of ways in which one could argue that the bailout might have been structured differently, sold differently so people understood it, that President Obama's stimulus might have been fashioned in a way that was more effective. So to say that the headline is it worked isn't to say that it couldn't have been better or wasn't without flaws.
Bob, one of the things that you reference in your piece is conventional wisdom that says the sharper the decline, the quicker the recovery. Well, what happened this time around? That did not hold.
Actually, that quip is from a former colleague, Victor Zarnowitz, who was a great student of the business cycle. This was not an ordinary recession. This was a collapse in real estate values that was associated with the failure of major financial institutions, and those are the factors that distinguish 2008 from 1980, 81, 1991, 1956, 1957. It was a unique collapse that we had not experienced since the 1930s.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, if I could, ask Bob a question. So I think you and I would give the U.S. authorities pretty good grades for how they handled a terrible situation. Could have been avoided, but they handled it with some reason. But now we're going through something in Europe that is being handled differently, and I wondered how you grade them with the hindsight that we now have and from the lessons of the Great Depression.
Are you describing the austerity approach versus the stimulus approach?
Yes, the austerity, their alacrity with which they bail out the banks, the way the monetary policy has been handled.
Okay. First, with respect to the U.S. authorities, a low grade before mid-September 2008 and a much higher grade since. They had no plans, no scenarios to deal with a possibility of a financial collapse. The Europeans face three different problems. One is the insolvency of some governments, Greece, perhaps Portugal. The second is bank capital requirements. The requirements out of Brussels, the banks raise capital at a time when markets are very fearful. And the third is a bank liquidity problem. The Europeans have been politically unable to come to the idea that Greece is a non-competitive society, that its prices and costs are much too high relative to those of every other country in the monetary union. Greece should be given an allowance, a finite allowance, and when it goes through that money, it will have the choice of what to do. There's a tremendous amount of unnecessary hardship, and it recalls Keynes's classic essay, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. So we will be writing about the economic consequences of Ms. Merkel, of President Sarkozy, Mademoiselle Lagarde, and their unwillingness to contemplate that Greece should have left the monetary union 2 years ago.
Is there any scenario for a robust U.S. recovery that doesn't involve a similar recovery across the ocean?
Well, the U.S., I would make a distinction between the recovery and the expansion.
Okay.
So the recovery is sort of when the economy got back to the GDP level, more or less at the peak. The GDP level, not the unemployment, not the employment number. And so recovery sort of begins in mid-2009. Since then, we've had a very sluggish expansion. And that's because we've had two drags on the economy. One is the drag of an excess supply of homes. So home building, which had been prior to the bubble years at 1.5 million units a year, has been running at the rate of 500,000 to 600,000 units a year. We're working our way through that problem. We're eating up the excess supply. The second factor, the second challenge to the United States is the surge in the U.S. trade deficit. That leads to an American spending that promotes jobs and profits in foreign countries at the expense of jobs and profits in the United States. That's an immense drag on the level of employment, the level of profits, the level of tax receipts in the United States. If the trade deficit increases, the more the trade deficit increases, the slower the expansion. The less rapidly the trade deficit increases, or if we continue to get a decline in the trade deficit, that's marvelous good news for the American economy.
I think that it's hard to get a robust expansion going without Europe being part of the global growth equation. And that's why we have such a big stake in what happens in Europe. But we see now that the pace of economic growth right now as we speak in the U.S. seems to be quickening despite all the problems in Europe. Europe is a very big part of our exports. So when Bob talks about the trade deficit, if we can't export to them as much, we'll have a bigger trade deficit. But other parts of the world have grown quite a bit, China in particular. And it may well be that we will do better than Europe for some time to come. That's totally plausible, and I'd say it's the most likely scenario.
Steve, I wonder from the editor's vantage point working on these stories, how has your thinking evolved? What new thoughts have emerged for you as a result of sorting through this?
Well, this is always a great learning experience when I do one of these packages. But I've also, in this case, had the privilege of having known Bob Aliber for some time and actually having published him before. And so I've learned a great deal from that. And one of the things I think that Bob's formula about the trade deficit, number one, is really important. I can't recall the number exactly, Bob, but the cost in terms of American jobs of every $1 billion of our trade deficit is really pretty extraordinary. One of the things that I've really come to appreciate also is the role of, it gets fairly technical, but exchange rates, an area in which Bob has done throughout his career a lot of work. And it gets to be very complicated, but I'll say that, Bob could have a whole show on the possibility that one solution to all the imbalances, or many of the imbalances that we've been seeing internationally, may be some attempt to modify our system of basically floating exchange rates between different countries, which create all sorts of possibilities, but also all sorts of problems. But we'll have to leave that for another show.
One of the things you wrote is one of the great puzzles of the recession is how the Fed could have been so oblivious to the bubble in home prices and the surge in housing starts. This raises up this question that continues to be debated, the blame game. Did we see it coming? Should we have seen it coming? Have the people who are guilty of driving us to the edge of the cliff been adequately exposed and punished? Both of your thoughts on this.
Well, I can't think of any part of the financial system, including the financial press, that performed admirably before the crisis. I mean, that's what's frightening about this. If you could just say it was one bond trader at J.P. Morgan Chase who was responsible for this and we could put him in jail, that would be great. But it's just not the case. And the Fed certainly failed, and I think they've learned the lesson. The people at the Fed tell me that during the run-up to this, they spent a lot of time debating, is there or isn't there a housing bubble? And their new way of framing things is to ask the question, well, okay, we don't really know if we're in a bubble now, but if we are, what are the implications? And to try and be more cognizant of the way that things are knit together.
David, you included yourself in the failure as part of that press, a big part of that press. With the benefit of 2020 hindsight, excuse me, are there things now when you look back that you miss that in retrospect seem more obvious?
Well, my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal can give you a long list of stories that if you just look at them in isolation, it looks like we were very prescient. But the fact is, if you look at all the things we didn't do enough stories about what was going on in housing. We, in the business press, continue to be cheerleaders. When the market's up, it's good. When the market's down, it's bad. And we kind of lose perspective. And one of the things that I've done, and I've encouraged my colleagues to do, is to remember that when 90 of 100 economists say everything's going to be great, we need to spend more time thinking and talking to those 10% who are out of consensus, because they're not always right. I mean, there's always somebody who says the world's going to end on Saturday and hopes someday he'll be right.
But they may be noticing something.
But we need to spend more time thinking about the points they're making so we don't get swept up in this groupthink, which I think was a big part of the problem.
About the blame game, should we have known?
Well, some of us did. So I was writing about the housing bubble in the spring of 2005.
And why weren't people listening?
That's the big mystery. And I think the question is whether the Fed and other financial institutions need Team B, a group of essentially outsiders within the institutions whose role it is to challenge the consensus. This groupthink, I think, is sort of still pervasive. Financial institutions are still guided by cliches like bailout, too big to fail. And this reliance on cliches essentially means that we fail to go one or two levels deeper into what are the underlying economic processes and whether they are sustainable. The tragedy is that the Fed failed to understand and realize that events in the developing countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina in the 70s, developments in Japan and in the Nordic countries in the late 1980s, and developments in the Asian countries in the early 1990s were bubbles, non-sustainable financial flows, and the Fed clearly lacks one or two economic historians who can develop the connections between events in other countries. And that may reflect, of course, the fact that we think we are unique. And we are, of course, unique, but we are not that different.
Still the laws of gravity apply.
One of the really interesting things about Bob's writing is that I was, of course, reading him when he was writing about the housing bubble in 2005. And in retrospect, and even at the time, it seemed pretty obvious, at least as you presented it. I mean, there's some basic arithmetic, in fact, that if you have a demand for only 500,000 new households every year, and you're building 2 million new houses every year, eventually you're going to have a problem. I'm not an economist, but I understood the logic of that. How is it possible to miss that logic? I mean,
we need a new profession, economic psychiatry. One of my former students, Sean Tully, a senior writer at Fortune, had articles in Fortune in 2004 about housing bubbles. And so the official institution, it is as if Washington is insulated from events outside the Beltway.
I think there are two reasons that these warnings get ignored. One is the warnings aren't always correct, and no one wants to end the party before it's time. And the second thing is housing has an extraordinary political appeal in Washington. So even today, people at the Federal Reserve say to me, well, what do you think would have happened if Alan Greenspan, then the Fed chairman, had given a speech and said, we think we're putting too much money into mortgages? And they imagine this huge reaction from Congress. There was this ideology that everybody in America wanted to own a house, and no one wanted to be the guy who said your house price should go down. I don't think that's an excuse. I think that's the job of the Federal Reserve chairman. But even today, I gave a talk to a bunch of low-income advocates recently, and I made the case that not everybody should own a house, that it's okay for some people to rent. And we had gone off the rails when we said that you had to own a house to be a successful American. And I got beat up by people who just think that's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, that strikes some emotional chord. It defies
that made
analysis.
it harder. It's not the full explanation. I mean, Bob Aliber and Charlie Kindleberger wrote a classic book on financial bubbles. And it's like a guide to what happened. And all their examples are from a time before I was born, but it could have been written about today. So there's something about human nature that we just don't want to believe that this can't go on.
Are we out of the woods yet?
We're out of the woods with respect to 2008 and the aftermath of the 2008 crises, except, of course, for Greece and Europe. And the question that follows is, are we susceptible to credit binges? Every one of the bubbles is preceded by a credit binge, and I would say, no, we're not out of the woods. We have a dysfunctional international financial system, and the banks have this ability to throw money at countries at a very rapid rate, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, and then the bankers realize that these countries' indebtedness is growing much too rapidly, and that is the scenario for the next crisis. So we may be out of the woods in the United States, but we're not out of the woods with respect to Brazil or Argentina or Turkey.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, David, as far as the overall zeitgeist? Has optimism started to win the day, or is there still much pessimism?
Well, I think there's still a great deal of pessimism in the public when you look at the polls, when you ask people, how well do you think Congress and the President is doing on economic policy? Do you think your kids will live better than you will, and stuff like that. So I think that we have turned a corner in the public mood in the last couple of weeks. There's a kind of beginning to be some confidence, which is welcome. But it is amazing how far we are from full employment today. There are nearly 4 million Americans who have been out of work for a year or more. And we haven't had a number like that in decades. And many of them will not ever go back to work. So this crisis will be one that has very long-lived effects. And I think it'll be quite some time before we know fully what they are.
Time for a quick preview of what's coming up in the next issue. What are you working on?
The Age of Connection, John. It's about the impact of social media, electronic communication generally, and its impact on us as individuals, but also as nations.
Sounds good. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for joining.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.